Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a stone chamber, so cold that the bed has to be heated before a princess even dares to touch it. The walls are sweating frost. The windows leak wind, like a bad secret. And somewhere, under layers of wool, fur, smoke, and candlelight, one noblewoman is trying to do something that sounds simple until you are actually inside a winter castle. Sleep. That is the answer waiting for us tonight. Not fairy tale comfort. Not effortless luxury. Something stranger, more human, and honestly a little admirable. A whole nightly struggle to make warmth where the building itself seems determined to betray you. If this is your kind of quiet history for the dark, do take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps keep these long candlelit nights alive. Now let the room go a little dimmer. Let the day loosen its grip. We are crossing a drawbridge now, very slowly, and the cold has already arrived before we do. The first thing you notice is the sound, not music, not courtly laughter. Wood under strain. The drawbridge groans beneath your boots with that old complaining sound only wet timber and winter can make. Frost powders each plank. It breaks with a dry little crunch underfoot, a brittle whisper that seems too small for a fortress this large. Yet it follows you all the way to the gate. Below, the moat is more ice than water, black in some places, silver in others. With a skin thin enough to catch moonlight and thick enough to hold the memory of several harder nights before this one. The air tastes metallic, iron, cold stone, wet rope, distant smoke. If you were standing here with me, I think you would pull your collar higher without even noticing. A gust slips along the bridge and pushes under your clothes with the confidence of something that has done this to everyone for centuries. At the gatehouse, the guards hunch close to a brazier, shoulders rounded, breath rising in pale bursts. Even their armor seems cold. Especially their armor. A medieval winter has a way of making metal look like a terrible life choice. Inside the walls, things should feel warmer. That is what the imagination always promises. Outside is hardship. Inside is shelter. Outside is wind. Inside is comfort. But castles are not really built to be kind. They are built to survive attack. And that is a very different talent. The air in the keep is only a little less vicious than the air on the bridge. Stone does not cradle heat. It swallows it. You feel that immediately through the soles of your shoes, as if the floor is quietly drinking whatever warmth you still had. Up in the great hall, a fire moves in a hearth large enough to roast an animal whole, and still the heat reaches only a few paces before it gives up and disappears into the dark. That is one of the deepest truths in the source script, and perhaps the most useful one. A castle in winter does not defeat the cold. It negotiates with it. Badly. On some nights, you look up and the hall goes on and on. Rafters disappear into shadow. Smoke lingers where it pleases. Torchlight trembles against stone and then seems to lose confidence halfway up the wall. Somewhere, a servant crosses the room with an armful of wood. Somewhere, a dog turns in its sleep. Somewhere, A door shuts and sends a small echo through the whole chamber. Even sound feels chilled in here. And above all of this, somewhere in the upper keep, a princess is preparing for bed. I have always found that contrast almost comical in the gentlest possible way. We grow up with polished images of royalty, silk sleeves, jewels at the throat, a face lit by candlelight, perhaps a perfectly placed sigh while snow falls beautifully outside. What the snow is actually doing, of course, it is trying to break into the room through every crack in the shutters, while the princess wonders if one more blanket would be vulgar or simply wise. Medieval life had a gift for making dignity work very hard. The climb to her chamber is its own small punishment. Spiral stairs narrow as they rise. Each stone step is colder than the one below. The air grows drier, thinner, somehow lonelier. There is less smell of food here, less noise from the hall, more wind pressing invisibly around corners. A torch smokes in its bracket. The flame bends when a draft finds it. You pass slit windows cut for defense, not comfort, and every one of them seems to breathe winter inward. At last there is the door. Heavy timber, ironwork, carvings softened by time, lilies, lions, curling leaves. Someone long dead commissioned beauty here, and beauty is still present, but it has not made the room warm. Inside, the chamber glows in faint candlelight. Thick drapes hang at the windows. A canopy bed rises at the center like a room within the room. Its carved posts twist upward in vines and leaves. The coverlet gleams with fur where the light touches it. Rugs soften the flagstones. A brazier holds a low red heart of coals. The whole arrangement is elegant, hushed, intimate, and yet the basic truth remains unchanged. This chamber is a tower room wrapped in winter. The source script is very good on this point. It keeps reminding us that castles of Northern Europe were built from materials excellent for keeping enemies out and dreadful for keeping warmth in. Limestone, granite, heavy masonry, strong, impressive, loyal in battle, absolutely miserable at bedtime. Heat dissipates fast. A roaring fire may make the area beside it pleasant for a little while, but the wider chamber remains cold shadow. That is why everything in the room has a purpose. The thick rugs do not lie there simply to look noble beneath candlelight. They trap a little warmth and spare royal feet from direct contact with stone. The canopy bed is not merely theatrical, though it certainly knows how to perform. Once its curtains are drawn, it creates a smaller pocket of air, a tiny climate that the body can actually influence. The drapes over the windows block some of the draft. The furniture is arranged so that whatever weak heat the hearth offers has at least a chance of drifting toward the bed before the walls swallow it. You can tell, just by looking, that this room has been learned through winters. Nothing is casual. Nothing is placed without reason. This is not decoration alone. It is strategy dressed in velvet. Now imagine the princess entering. Her gowns whisper over the floor. The jewels at her wrists and throat catch the candlelight, but they also carry the cold. Metal has no pity. She lifts one necklace free, then another, then the rings from her fingers, one by one, and the room grows quieter with each small sound. A maid appears with a basin of warm water. Steam uncurls into the air and immediately begins to vanish. Another maid adjusts the curtains around the bed. A third arrives carrying one of the most marvelous practical inventions in old domestic life, a bed warmer, a metal pan filled with hot coals. Its lid pierced in patterns, fine enough to look decorative, until you remember its only job is to wage war on freezing linen. The servant slides it between the sheets and moves it slowly, carefully, in circles. I think that may be one of my favorite images in the entire source. Not because it is grand, but because it is so revealing. There you have medieval royalty in one scene. Four, embroidery, candlelight, carved oak, and under all that refinement, someone literally ironing the cold out of the bed before the princess gets in. History becomes very lovable when it stops posing. You can almost smell the faint tang of hot iron and scorched air. You can hear the soft hiss when trapped damp meets sudden heat. The maid keeps the pan moving. Too long in one place and you burn the sheets. Or worse. Comfort and disaster lie very close together in a castle bedroom. And then there are the smaller details, the wonderfully strange ones. The source mentions the belief that a warm hen beneath the bed might help keep the air mild overnight. It sounds ridiculous until you remember that people will try almost anything when cold enters the bones. There are also little dogs tucked into blankets, both for companionship and for the steady pulse of animal warmth. That detail I believe instantly. Human history is full of serious architecture and very unserious little dogs. Outside, wolves cry somewhere beyond the walls. Or perhaps not wolves every time. Perhaps only the wind arranging itself theatrically among the trees and moorland. Medieval nights encouraged imagination. The princess may hear those sounds as she stands before the mirror, watching her own breath cloud the glass. Frost feathers the corners of the panes. She tightens her robe a little, not out of fear exactly, but because winter has a presence, and tonight it is pressing itself against every outer surface of the castle. The source quite rightly notes that historians still debate how comfortable castles ever really were in winter. Some argue that noble households abandoned certain fortresses in the coldest months and retreated to smaller residences, manor houses, townhomes, places easier to heat and easier to live in. Others argue that courts remained active inside these great stone bodies all year, with servants, guards, kitchens, and ceremony keeping life in motion despite the weather. Both may be true depending on the region, to the century, the household, and the specific castle. But whichever side one prefers, the core truth remains. A winter night in one of these places was no gentle thing. The princess moves toward the bed at last. Her chamber smells of wool, food, tallow, smoke, and something softer, lavender perhaps, or rosemary crushed into linen somewhere nearby. In the corner, the cat has folded itself beside the brazier, a creature who clearly understands priorities. The candle flame leans once in a draught and rights itself again. Bed curtains sway as if the room itself has exhaled. The princess sits at the mattress edge and tests the warmth left by the bed warmer. Beneath the sheets are layers. Linen. Wool. Perhaps feathers in the upper mattress. Perhaps straw below. The source keeps emphasizing that sleeping warm in this world required architecture within architecture, and the bed proves it. The castle shelters the room. The room shelters the bed. The bed curtains shelter the sleeper. The blankets shelter the body. Every layer is another little refusal of the cold. And still the cold is there. That is the quiet, dark truth under the title. How did princesses sleep in medieval castles during the coldest nights? Not by living in comfort so complete that winter ceased to matter. They slept by ritual, by servants, by furs, by heated pans, by draped fabric, by patience, by not expecting miracles from stone. They slept the way all human beings have slept in hard places, by making a small island of warmth and calling it enough until dawn. As she lies back, the last candle flicker touches her face. Her hand comes to rest on the embroidered sheet. Her eyes grow heavy. Somewhere below, the great hall fire cracks louder for a moment. Somewhere above, the wind drags itself along the battlements. Somewhere in the wall, old wood gives a tired little creak. The castle does not fall silent. It never truly does. It breathes, settles, complains, remembers, and you begin to understand the rhythm of the place. This is not the sleep of ease. It is the sleep of endurance. The princess does not drift off because the world has become gentle. She sleeps because the body can only keep its vigil so long, because her maids have done what can be done, because the bed has been warmed, because the curtains are drawn, because the brazier glows, because the cat is content, because tomorrow will come whether the room is comfortable or not. And once that settles in, another question rises naturally from the dark. If the chamber is this cold even after all this care, what was the rest of the castle like through the long hours after midnight, when the fire sinks, the draughts return, and every comfort has to prove whether it was real or merely beautiful? The deeper you stay in the castle, the more you realize something almost impolite about medieval architecture. It does not love the people living inside it. It protects them. Certainly. It impresses visitors, intimidates enemies, survives siege, resists fire better than timber halls, and rises over the landscape with a kind of grim confidence. But affection is not its strongest quality. A winter castle is a stern companion. It gives shelter while keeping a little of the outdoors alive in every chamber. That is why the source spends so much time on the simple fact of stone. Stone is magnificent in daylight. It makes a wall feel eternal. It gives a tower authority. It catches torchlight beautifully and holds memory in every chipped stair and worn threshold. But by midnight in January, stone becomes a silent thief. Touch it with your fingertips and the cold does not sit on the surface. It reaches inward. Damp, mineral, ancien, a cold that feels older than weather and more patient than fire. If you were standing at the princess's window now, with the candle behind you and frost blooming on the inside of the pane, you would understand at once why the source refuses to romanticize the place. The castle is not warm. It is only less exposed. That is a very medieval kind of comfort. The windows tell the story best. Modern people tend to imagine great, clear panes of glass in every noble room, perhaps because our minds have been poisoned by costume dramas, in which every castle somehow enjoys 19th century convenience. In reality, many northern castles spent long centuries with oiled cloth, horn, parchment, or thin slices of translucent material over the openings, enough to soften wind, enough to admit daylight, nowhere near enough to defeat winter. Even once glass became more common, it was expensive, fragile, uneven, and badly sealed. A window was still, in practical terms, an agreement with the cold rather than a victory over it. You can hear it now. A soft rattle in the frame, a whisper at the edge of the shutters, a patient little intrusion that never really stops. The source is excellent on this. Every window is an invitation to the wind. That line stays with me because it feels exactly right. No matter how carefully the room is arranged, some sliver of night always finds its way in. The princess lies beneath her coverlets, and the room continues its subtle betrayals. A draught slips under the bed curtain and brushes her cheek. Another finds the floor and travels along the stones beneath the rugs. The hearth glows lower than it did an hour ago. The brazier still pulses red in the corner, but even that heat seems private, claimed by the cat in the air nearest it. This is where the nightly battle truly begins. Not at sunset. Oddly enough, at sunset one still has ceremony, motion, servants moving in and out, tasks to do, a bed to prepare, a basin steaming, a fire with confidence in it. The harsher part begins later, when the room has settled and the body has gone still. Stillness lets the cold notice you. That, I think, is one of the hidden truths in the source. To sleep in a medieval castle during the deepest winter was to lie quietly while the room resumed being what it always wanted to be, cold. The bed curtains help, of course. They are not decorative nonsense, though they certainly know how to look dramatic. Once drawn close, they trap the princess's own warmth, however little of it there may be at first. Her breathing begins to matter. The small heat of skin matters. Air inside the canopy changes texture by degrees. A little cave of survivable warmth forms where before there was none. You know that feeling when you first slip under cold sheets and the bed seems almost offended by your presence. And then slowly, very slowly, your body persuades one small area to become habitable. Imagine that, but with a stone tower, bad window seals, and a world outside trying to freeze the moat solid. That is the scale we are dealing with. And so the next phase of defense moves inward, from architecture to cloth. Long before midnight, the maidens have already begun that quiet procession the source describes so well. One with linen, one with wool, one with warm water, one perhaps with a fur-lined robe folded over her arm. The princess sits before a mirror that catches candlelight imperfectly, its surface alive with soft, wavering gold. While steam from the basin rises and vanishes, there is rosemary in the water perhaps, or another herb trusted to comfort the body and discourage sickness. Medieval people lived close to scent. close to texture, close to ritual. When medicine is uncertain, ritual becomes its own form of medicine. Fabric whispers in that chamber like another language. A linen shift first, dry and clean. Then stockings. Then wool. Because wool is honest about winter in a way silk never will be. Then heavier layers. Perhaps fur at the edges. Perhaps a thick robe lined against the cold. The source notes that noble women's night clothing could become almost as elaborate as their daytime dress, and I believe it immediately. You do not survive a January tower room on elegance alone. The humor is gentle, but it is there. Imagine trying to be graceful under that many layers. Imagine preserving royal dignity while essentially dressing yourself as a padded parcel. Yet this is exactly where the source becomes most human. These princesses were not symbols drifting through draftless palaces. They were women in freezing buildings trying not to wake, with stiff fingers and aching joints. Some scholars argue that these layers were surprisingly effective, especially when combined with furs and enclosed beds. Others suggest that too many fabrics trapped moisture and made the sleeper clammy, which could become its own kind of misery once the warmth faded. It is a debate worth keeping alive in the telling, because medieval comfort was rarely absolute. Most likely the truth sat where it usually does, in the middle. Layering helped. It also had limits. Warm enough to endure. Not warm enough to forget the weather. I have always found it strange that when people imagine historical luxury, they rarely imagine the sheer amount of management it required. Nothing in this chamber is casual. Warm water must be heated and carried. Clothes must be laid out. Curtains must be drawn. Embers must be watched. Bedding must be aired, fluffed, dried, protected from damp, protected from pests, protected from sparks, protected from the room itself. Every comfort is really work that someone has already done. And then comes the bed. The source gives the bed its due, and rightly so, because in a place like this, the bed is not furniture. It is engineering. It is prestige. It is a social statement and a survival capsule at once. It rises high above the floor, far enough that a stool may be needed to climb in, that height matters. The further from stone, the better. Beneath the top mattress there may be another layer, coarser, straw-filled perhaps, there to insulate and absorb. Above it, for the wealthy, feather mattresses. Goose down, swan feathers, if one is very fortunate and very well supplied. Then quilts. Then fur-lined coverlets. Then whatever extra blankets the weather seems likely to demand. You can almost hear it when the princess settles into place. A faint rustle. Feathers shifting. Wool brushing linen. The quiet cave of the bed taking her shape. Under her pillow lies lavender and chamomile, perhaps. Or mint. Or thyme. The source leans beautifully into the use of herbs, both for scent and for practical defense against insects and stale air. That matters because winter discomfort in a castle was not only cold. It was odor, smoke, damp, vermin, confinement. Royalty could perfume the experience, but they could not fully abolish it. A sachet of herbs beneath the pillow is both luxury and refusal. a little pocket of summer hidden in the dark. The source also mentions something I adore, the possibility of charms sewn into bedding, tiny prayers folded into seams, protective symbols hidden where the sleeper would never see them once the bed was made. It reminds you that medieval warmth was not only physical, it was spiritual insurance. If the room is full of drafts and noises and uncertain dreams, then perhaps one more Latin prayer stitched into the mattress is not superstition so much as companionship. The bed, then, becomes a world within the room. Curtains overhead like a private sky. Pillows holding scent. Coverlets holding heat. Feathers shifting into hollows of warmth. The princess on her side, perhaps, drawing the fur a little closer under her chin. Outside the curtains, the chamber remains cold enough to frighten the washwater by dawn. Inside them, the air slowly grows bearable. Still, the cold keeps testing the boundaries. A gust presses at the shutters. One curtain edge stirs. The hearth gives a small crack as a log settles in on itself. The cat opens one eye. Somewhere lower in the castle, a door closes, followed by the diminishing rhythm of footsteps in a corridor. Then the room returns to its layered silence. And in that silence, you begin to understand why the source describes medieval sleep as a surrender to the elements. Not because nothing was done. So much was done. Curtains, coals, layers, hearths, rugs, servants, timing, habit. But after all of that, there still comes a point where one must lie down and trust the little island of warmth one has made. There is humility in that. No certainty. Only preparation, and then sleep. The source also lingers on posture, which I think is a lovely detail. Some believed that sleeping more upright could help breathing, digestion, and the management of bad humors in a room thick with smoke or damp. Others dismiss this as overdrawn or unevenly practiced. Yet the idea itself belongs perfectly in the atmosphere. Even sleeping position becomes part of winter strategy. Nothing is left entirely to chance. And so the princess lies in the dark, not only dressed for bed but armored for it. Her final robe tied close, her sleeves whispering as she folds her hands once before sleep. The basin has gone. The heat of it lingers only as memory in the air. The maids have withdrawn. The last candle has been lowered or extinguished. Only embers remain. Outside, snow begins again, soft against shutters, a sound like fingers brushing cloth. Inside, her breath forms and fades in the small, warm world under the curtains. She dreams perhaps of summer gardens, perhaps of duty, perhaps of nothing that can be named in daylight. The source is wise here too. It does not pretend the princess has transcended her station or her circumstances. She sleeps under expectation as much as under blankets. Bloodline, marriage, politics, ceremony, all of it waits outside the bed with the same patience as winter. Yet for a few hours the body asks only for warmth enough to stay asleep. That may be the most democratic thing in the whole room. Whether servant or princess, everyone must negotiate the same cold night, only with different materials, different scents, different chances of success. and by the time the room sinks into its deepest hush, you begin to understand that the question in the title does not really have one answer. How did princesses sleep in medieval castles during the coldest nights? By bed, curtains, and fur. By herbs and feather mattresses. By servant labor and warming pans. By wool and patience. By lying still inside a fortress, within a fortress, and letting the body build what little warmth it could hold. By accepting that the castle would never love them back, and sleeping anyway. By the time the bed has been warmed and the curtains drawn, you begin to understand something the princess probably understood from childhood. The room is not her enemy. The whole castle is. Every wall, every stair, every shutter, every stone passage carries winter in its bones, and all her luxuries are only small answers to a very large question. How do you rest inside a place built to resist armies rather than protect sleep? The answer begins with the walls. If you step away from the bed now, just for a moment, and press your hand to the stone, the truth arrives all at once. The surface is damp with old cold, not the quick, sharp chill of metal, but a deeper mineral cold that seems to have settled there long before sunset and long before this particular winter. It is the kind of cold that does not sit on the skin, but eases slowly inward, as if the wall is patiently teaching your body the ancient habits of rock. That is why the source keeps returning to the basic materials of medieval castles. Limestone, granite, heavy masonry, wonderful for surviving a siege, miserable for preserving warmth. A fire can blaze for hours and still leave most of a room untouched. The stone drinks the heat, then gives almost nothing back. It is like trying to warm a cathedral with a candle. Beautiful in theory, humbling in practice. You cross the chamber softly and stop beside the window. The shutters are thick, but not faithful. They keep out the worst of the weather while inviting in enough to remind you who is in charge. A sliver of air slides through the seam and brushes your knuckles. It is so fine at first that you might mistake it for imagination. Then it sharpens, and there is no mistaking it. The window is breathing winter into the room. Some castles had glass by the later medieval centuries. Some did not. Even where glass existed, it was thin, expensive, uneven, and not very good at keeping anything out except perhaps direct rain. Earlier coverings could be parchment, horn, or other translucent materials that admitted light with very little concern for comfort. It is one of those useful facts that strips the fairy tale varnish right off the scene. A princess might sleep behind embroidery and gold thread, yes, but her window could still be an elaborate agreement with the wind. You hear it now. A soft tapping. Not a hand. Just frost and air rearranging themselves around the frame. Then a tiny rattle. Then stillness again. The source is wise to dwell on sound, because medieval cold is never silent. The room creaks. The beams shift. Somewhere in the chimney, a draft changes direction and makes the ashes murmur. The shutters answer with a tired little complaint. Far below, a door closes, and the echo wanders through the keep, like it is looking for somewhere to lie down. Even the princess, half asleep inside her bed curtains, would know the castle by ear at night. She would know which creak meant timber settling, which hiss meant the fire was weakening, which sudden knock at the shutters was only wind, and not something more alarming. You know that feeling when an old house begins to speak after midnight, and every sound seems full of opinions. A medieval castle is that feeling given stone walls and military ambition, and it never truly stops breathing. The source describes the castle not as a place that keeps the cold out, but as one that slows its advance. That may be the finest line in the whole material, because it tells the truth without trying to dramatize it. Winter is always entering. The people inside are simply learning how to delay it. Tapestries delay it. Rugs delay it. Curtains delay it. Fire delays it. Bodies delay it. Nothing defeats it for long. That is why the bed matters so much. It is not just where the princess sleeps. It is where resistance becomes focused. Outside the curtains, the room is compromised. Inside them, there is still a chance. But before sleep can settle in fully, the architecture of cold still makes one more demand. It requires adaptation. The source moves through this beautifully by showing how every object becomes double in meaning. A tapestry is not just decoration. It is insulation. A rug is not just status. It is a barrier between skin and frozen floor. A canopy is not just grandeur. It is a roof for a smaller climate. Even the placement of furniture becomes strategy. A chair slightly nearer the hearth. A chest along an outer wall. A screen beside a draft. Medieval rooms often look symbolic to us because we enter them through paintings and museum labels. In reality, they were practical in the way all hard-lived spaces become practical. Beauty survived there because it learned to help. Look at the wall hangings now. Their woven figures flicker in the last warmth of the fire. Sun, birds, veen, hounds, perhaps battles, perhaps flowers. In daylight, one might admire their workmanship first. At midnight, one admires their thickness. Cloth against stone can make enough difference to matter. Not enough to transform winter into spring, of course. Enough to turn misery into endurance. Which, in a season like this, is not a small accomplishment. Some scholars argue that such hangings served mostly to display wealth, especially in great royal spaces. Others insist they truly altered the temperature of a chamber by trapping small pockets of air between fabric and wall. Both may be true, and medieval life is full of these pleasing double truths. The richest people owned the most useful beauty. The most practical comforts were also proofs of rank. A princess might warm herself with art and announce her status at the same time. Human beings rarely miss a chance to combine necessity with prestige. You move back toward the hearth. It is no longer roaring now. The flames have quieted. The logs have settled lower into themselves. The orange light is steady but more intimate, less triumphant. This is another thing the source understands well. Fire is not a one-time victory. It is a relationship. Feed it too little and the room turns cruel again. Feed it too much and smoke, sparks, and danger grow bold. Medieval warmth was not an appliance. It was a living negotiation. The stones around the hearth are blackened with old soot. Centuries of winters have written themselves there in smoke. You can smell oak, ash, and something sweet from old herbs thrown in perhaps. Rosemary or thyme crackling softly as they meet the embers. The smell is grounding. It makes the chamber feel inhabited, held, almost gentle for a few breaths. Then you step 2 paces back and feel the air cool again. That is how narrow the margin is. And yet people adapted. Of course they did. Human beings are astonishing when discomfort becomes routine. The source mentions warmed stones wrapped in cloth, crude hot water containers, bowls of embers placed beneath or near the bed, layers of extra hangings over windows. Even beliefs that certain arrangements of fabric and heat changed not just the temperature of a chamber, but the mood within it. Medieval people lived close to superstition and observation at the same time. If a trick seemed to help twice, it was remembered. If it smelled pleasant as well, it was practically law. I have always found that charming. Not foolish, charming. The world was hard. Why should they not trust rosemary, prayer, hot metal, vol, and a little hopeful nonsense all at once? The princess beneath her covers shifts and tightens the blankets around her shoulders. It is a tiny movement, almost nothing, but it tells you everything. Even with all this preparation, the cold still negotiates. She must answer it in her sleep with instinct. Pull closer, curl inward, preserve heat, become smaller and warmer at once. That idea becomes even clearer as the source turns from room to body. Because if the chamber cannot be fully conquered, then the sleeper herself must become part of the architecture of warmth. Before bed, her clothing is not merely clothing. It is insulation in stage. Linen close to skin. Wool beyond that. Stockings. Under layers. Fur-lined garments. Thick robe. All of it chosen not just for modesty or beauty, but for heat management. Medieval nobility did not separate dignity from survival. They wore both at once. You can picture it now in slow detail. A maid holding the fresh linen shift. Another with wool stockings looped over her arm. The princess rising from the stool before her mirror. Steam from the basin touching her face and then fading away. Candlelight catching on a ring she has not yet removed. Her sleeves brushing each other with that dry whisper fine textiles make in still air. The room is cold enough that every garment matters, and the act of dressing for bed becomes almost ceremonial. There is humor in it too, quiet humor. A modern person might think royalty slept in airy comfort and scandalously little fabric. Medieval winter would cure that fantasy very quickly. A princess on a truly brutal night is less like a fairy tale maiden and more like a carefully wrapped heirloom being stored against weather. Still, there is grace in the layering. The source notes that some chroniclers describe noblewomen in multiple undergarments, padded pieces, heavy night robes, for trims, and other additions that blur the line between bedclothes and armor. Some historians think such layering worked quite well by trapping warm air. Others argue that too much fabric could become damp and unpleasant. Again, the truth likely sat somewhere in between. Effective enough to repeat, imperfect enough to complain about. And then there is etiquette. This is one of my favorite medieval absurdities. Even in a freezing room, dignity must be maintained. Undressing is supervised, controlled, formalized. Garments are handed, folded, received. Exposure is managed with care. The body is practical, but it is never allowed to forget courtliness. Imagine trying to preserve royal composure while essentially preparing to hibernate under several pounds of fabric. If that is not discipline, I do not know what is. The princess finally approaches the bed once more. The stool waits. The curtains are parted. The sheet warmed earlier has already begun losing some of that precious gift, because warmth in this world is always vanishing the moment it arrives. Still, inside the bed, there is a better chance than anywhere else in the room. She climbs in. There is the slight sigh of feathers taking weight. The hollow under her shoulder forms. The coverlets rise and settle. Beneath the pillow, a sachet of lavender. Chamomile or mint lets out a little more scent now that body heat has reached it. The source is especially good when it lingers on these details, because it reminds you that sleep in a castle was sensory management as much as temperature management. Wool against skin. Herbs against stale air. Smoke in the room. Fur at the chin. Linen under the hand. Even luxury has texture. Especially luxury. Some nights the princess may sleep almost sitting, or slightly raised, perhaps from custom, perhaps from belief. Perhaps simply because breathing in a curtained bed with smoke still lingering in the room can be easier that way. The source notes the long life of this idea, and whether it was universal or not matters less than the atmosphere it creates. Nothing is casual here. Even posture belongs to survival. The castle continues speaking softly around her. A beam pops. The shutter answers. Ash settles in the hearth with a faint inward sigh. Somewhere in the corridor outside the chamber, a servant coughs and moves on. The princess remains still. She has heard all of this before. The room frightens only those who do not yet know its habits. And then, slowly, the final lesson arrives. A medieval princess did not sleep warm because the castle was comfortable. She slept warm because everyone and everything around her had conspired to make one small zone of warmth out of a hostile room. Stone was held back by cloth. Drafts were held back by curtains. Linen was heated by iron. Bedclothes held body heat. Servants fed embers. Herbs eased the stale air. The cat claimed the brazier. The princess curled inward and let the bed become a little climate of its own. It is a humble answer disguised by splendor. And it leads naturally to the next question, because once the room, the bed, and the body have done all they can, what remains through the deeper hours is the long work of fire, bedding, serval, and the hidden systems that must carry warmth from midnight until dawn. If the castle itself is the enemy, then the bed is the front line. That may sound dramatic for something stuffed with feathers and covered in embroidered cloth, but I think it is true. By the time the chamber settles into its midnight hush, The princess is no longer depending on the room to save her from winter. She is depending on the small kingdom built around her body. Mattress, curtains, quilts, fur, warmth trapped in layers. This is where medieval comfort stops being decorative and becomes technical. The source knows this and lingers on the bed as if it were a machine made of linen. Oa and rank. Look at it closely. The frame rises high above the floor. That alone matters more than most modern people realize. Cold gathers low. Drafts travel low. Stone punishes anything that sleeps too near it. So the bed climbs upward, away from the floor, onto ropes or boards, with one mattress above another, and often a stool, waiting at the foot like a small acknowledgement that privilege can be inconvenient in amusing ways. The princess does not simply slip into bed. She ascends into it. There is something fitting in that. A royal bed is both shelter and stage. The canopy overhead is carved, draped, and heavy. In daylight, it signals status. In winter darkness, it becomes a practical ceiling for trapped warmth. Draw the curtains around the bed and suddenly the body is not trying to warm an entire chamber. It is trying to warm a small enclosed pocket of air. That shift changes everything. Not enough to make the night easy, but enough to make it survivable. You can hear the curtains when the maid draws them. A thick, sliding whisper, fabric over rod, fabric settling against fabric, the softest possible sound for such serious work. It is one of those noises that belongs entirely to enclosed spaces and old houses. The sound of a world shrinking down to manageable size. Inside that smaller world lies the mattress. The source gives us goose feathers for the wealthy, straw or wool beneath, perhaps coarser matter below the upper softness to keep the sleeper from feeling the boards or ropes underneath. That layering is important. People often imagine a feather bed as the whole story. But medieval bedding was usually more complicated. One layer for softness, another for insulation, another to absorb, another to keep shape. Even the bed understood hierarchy. I have always liked that medieval people solved problems by adding layers until the thing either worked or became someone else's problem. More bedding, more cloth, more fur, more servants. It is a system I can almost admire. The princess settles into the mattress, and it answers with a faint rustle. Not the silence of modern upholstery, but the honest sound of feathers shifting, linen pulling, filling redistributing itself under real weight. That sound alone tells you this bed has memory. It remembers every night of use, every careful turning by servants at dawn, every airing, every refilling, every little repair sewn into its seams so that privilege can continue pretending it is effortless. Beneath the upper softness, there may be a coarser under mattress. And under that, the bed frame itself, rope or boards. And under that, nothing but air and the hard, cold world of the floor. It is a delicate little vertical hierarchy. Civilization on top, winter underneath. Under her pillow lies another medieval answer to discomfort. Scent. The source is full of herbs, and rightly so. Lavender, chamomile, mint, thyme, rosemary. Sweetness and sharpness tucked into cloth and hidden near the face where breath can wake them. Part luxury, part pest defense, part prayer in plant form. In a room where the air might otherwise smell of smoke, wool, damp stone, old wood, fur, and the faint mustiness of closed winter spaces, herbs matter. They do not merely perfume the bed. They civilize it. You can almost smell it now if you stay still enough. The dry sweetness of lavender, a green note beneath it. Something clean, almost medicinal. A tiny summer folded into a pillow seam. The source also gives us one of my favorite details. Protective charms hidden in bedding. Scraps of parchment. Latin prayers. Stitched symbols. Not always, not everywhere, but enough that a listener can feel the atmosphere correctly. Medieval warmth was never purely physical. The night carried cold, yes, but also dreams, spirits, illness, unease, memory. If a hidden prayer could warm the soul a little while the bed warmed the body, then why should anyone object? You know that feeling when a room is difficult and someone adds one small thing that does not solve the problem but makes it feel less lonely. That is what these details do. A sachet, a sham, a scent, a little faith sewn into the seam. The bedclothes themselves become architecture. First, the sheets, perhaps linen, cool at first, unless the bed warmer has done its job very well. Then blankets. Then quilts. Then coverlets lined with fur. Each one laid, folded, smoothed, adjusted. Each one a new argument against the cold. The source is careful not to pretend these were all equal in quality. Bedding was rank made visible. Commoners had straw pallets. Servants had simpler wool layers. Fractor nobility enjoyed feathers, fuss, viner linen, more pieces between themselves and the season. Warmth had hierarchy. Of course it did. And still, no amount of wealth turned winter into spring. That is what I appreciate most about this material. It never lets luxury become fantasy. A princess had far more comfort than her servants. Certainly. But she still woke to stiff fingers some mornings. She still breathed cold air under the bed curtains on the cruelest nights. She still depended on rituals, timing, lavor, and luck. Now the fire matters again. Because no bed, however splendid, begins warm on its own. The source returns us to the warming pan, and I am glad it does, because it is such a perfectly medieval object. A pan of metal filled with hot coals, passed between the sheets before the sleeper enters. It is elegant and dangerous in equal measure. The lid may be patterned, almost beautiful. The purpose is brutally practical. Chase the cold out before it claims the linen for the night. The maid moves it slowly, tracing circles and lines beneath the covers. You can almost hear the muted scrape and soft hiss. There is skill in it. Too fast, and the heat is wasted. Too long in one place, and you scorch the bedding, perhaps even start a fire, which would be a poor reward for trying to go to sleep warm. Medieval life had a gift for making comfort and catastrophe neighbors. Some households also used warmed stones wrapped in cloth, metal containers of hot water, or other devices that were essentially ancestors of the modern hot water bottle, only with more risk and worse public relations. The source even gives us those odd little historical fragments about animal bladders filled with heat, or curious warming tricks that feel half practical and half improvised. I treasure such details. They are the fingerprints of real people trying not to freeze. Then there are living warmers. The source mentions hens, and that detail is so charmingly absurd that I would keep it even if it were only half true. A warm hen beneath the bed, a small dog in the covers, a cat by the brazier, comfort hounds at the feet. One cannot accuse the medieval world of lacking imagination, and yet the logic is entirely sound. A warm body gives heat. A small creature curls naturally into wasted space. Royalty may have had servants and fur, but they were still mammals in winter. A dog at the feet is good sense dressed up as affection. I have always suspected history survives in memory best, where it allows itself to be a little ridiculous. A princess in a carved oak bed, behind curtains embroidered with saints and vines, warmed by goose feathers, herbs, hot coals, and perhaps a tiny dog in ribbons. That is not less dignified than the legend. It is better. It is alive. The source also reminds us that the bed was not merely the center of warmth, but the center of privacy, such as privacy could exist in a castle at all. Curtains close. The room recedes. A small world forms. Outside it, servants move softly. A brazier glows. The castle creaks. Winter prowls. Inside it, breath grows warmer. Linen softens. And the body begins at last to persuade the air around it to become hospitable. This is where the princess really begins to sleep. Not at the moment she lies down. At the moment the bed stops feeling foreign and starts feeling inhabited. When the cold linen has taken the memory of her heat. When the pillow scent has risen. When the fur at her chin no longer feels heavy but protective. When her breathing slows enough to do its part in warming the enclosed air. Sleep in such a place is not a switch. It is a negotiation that gradually turns in the sleeper's favor. And still the castle tests the arrangement. A draft finds the outer curtain. A log settles in the hearth. Frost creeps thicker on the window pane. The princess curls tighter. Her maid may return later to feed the fire. Another blanket waits, folded at the foot of the bed in case the night worsens. The source rightly emphasizes that none of this is static. Warmth is maintained, not achieved once and for all. That is what gives the whole subject its quiet dignity. A princess sleeping warmly in a medieval castle is not the image of passive luxury. It is the result of repeated human effort, objects placed with intelligence, cloth layered with experience, servants moving at the right hour, the body folding in on itself wisely, and a bed built as a fortress within a fortress. There is something almost moving in how much thought was required just to rest. So by the time the chamber falls into its deepest dark, you understand the bed not as a symbol of ease, but as a compact between body and world. The castle offers grandeur and danger. The bed offers a smaller answer. Warmth enough to last a few hours. fragrance enough to sweeten stale air, curtains enough to turn one sleeper into the center of her own climate, feathers enough to soften the boards, fur enough to bargain with winter until morning. And as the source drifts onward, it becomes clear that even this cocoon is not sufficient by itself. The bed may hold warmth, but something still has to feed the hearth. Stir the ashes, manage the tapestries, maintain the fabric barriers, and keep the whole fragile system from collapsing before dawn. That is where the story widens again, from the princess and her bed to the network of fire, cloth, servants, and living warmth that made the night possible at all. By the time the castle has settled into its midnight breathing, you begin to understand that no single object keeps a princess warm. Not the bed alone, not the curtains alone, not the robe, the rugs, the furs, or even the walls, which do their best by mostly failing. Warmth in a winter castle is not a possession. It is a system, a chain of little defenses, each one imperfect, each one depending on the others. And at the center of that chain burns the hearth, or tries to. The fire has a personality by this hour. Earlier in the evening it was lively, proud of itself, all crackle and spark and orange ambition. Now it has grown quieter, more thoughtful, its flames lower, its glow steadier, as though it too has accepted that the night will be long and waste no energy pretending otherwise. The princess sits near it in the last stretch before sleep, her hands lifted toward the warmth. Not too close, because heat can bite as quickly as cold if you are careless. And because the jewelry she has not yet removed catches the firelight and makes her fingers look warmer than they feel. The source is especially good when it lingers on the hearth, because the hearth is not merely decoration. It is the room's pulse. In some castles, the fireplaces were enormous, big enough that a person could almost stand inside them, with stone hoods overhead and blackened backs polished by centuries of smoke. That size was not vanity. It was necessity. A smaller fire would have been swallowed whole by the chamber before anyone could benefit from it. Yet even these giant hearths could not truly master the cold. They created circles of possibility, islands of tolerable air in rooms still ruled by shadow. You can feel it if you move your hands slowly. Near the flames. Warmth. One step back. A gentler version of it. Another step, and already the air begins to empty itself of kindness. By the time you reach the edge of the chamber, the cold has returned as if it had only stepped aside for a moment out of politeness. I have always found that slightly heartbreaking. Such effort for such a narrow victory. Logs hauled, fires banked, chimneys built high, smoke endured, ash cleaned, sparks watched, and still the room is only partly warmed. But perhaps that is what makes the scene so human. Medieval life did not promise perfection. It offered management, persistence, adjustment, and the hope that enough small successes would carry one through to dawn. The princess leans forward and nudges a log with the poker. A brief shower of sparks lifts and vanishes before reaching the dark above. The scent sharpens at once. Oak, old soot, a little sap hissing out through the grain. And beneath it all, that faint sweetness, the source mentions when herbs are scattered into the flames. Sage, perhaps. Rosemary. Thyme. The effect is both practical and ceremonial. It freshens the air. It pleases the senses. It suggests, in a world that loved these delicate overlaps, that warmth should smell holy as well as feel useful. Some households believed the smoke carried protection through the room. Others likely thought only that it made the chamber less stale and less rank. Both ideas may have lived side by side quite happily. Medieval people were not especially bothered by keeping science and superstition as neighbors. If something worked a little and comforted a lot, that was often enough. The source also reminds us that fire was expensive in ways modern people rarely stop to imagine. Wood was not just lying around waiting to become ambiance. It had to be cut, dried, stored, counted, rationed, carried. Whole forests could thin under the appetite of a great household surviving winter. In some castles, records survive showing allowances of fuel for specific rooms, as carefully measured as wine or silver. Warmth itself had inventory. That fact changes the mood of the hearth immediately. The fire is no longer just a pleasant image. It is labor turned into flame. And because it is precious, it is never left entirely alone. Some scholars argue that great chamber fires were allowed to die low overnight for safety. Others believe servants kept them half alive through the small hours, feeding them at intervals so their ladies did not wake to frozen air and dead ash. The truth probably varied by household and by the temperament of everyone involved. A reckless castle burned. A stingy castle froze. Somewhere between those two insults stood ordinary medieval judgment. That is where the hidden network of service enters the story. The princess may sit beautifully by the hearth, but the heat belongs to many hands. A servant chopped or counted the wood. Another carried it. Another laid the fire. Another swept the soot. Another checked the curtains were far enough from sparks. Another would return before dawn to coax life back from embers. Royal warmth was never solitary. It was communal labor disguised as comfort. You hear it in the room even now. The faint tread in the corridor. The soft knock of wood set down somewhere outside. The brief opening of the door, quickly closed to keep the warm air from fleeing outright. A maid slips in, moves to the hearth, nails, and with practiced hands banks the coals so they will last longer. Not a dramatic task. Not one sung about in epics. Yet the entire illusion of gentle, noble sleep depends on it. Honestly, that may be my favorite truth in this part of the source. The princess sleeps in warmth because someone else remains slightly colder. History is full of that arrangement. Still, the room has other allies besides fire. Look up now at the tapestries. In daylight, they are stories. At midnight, they are walls within walls. The source gives them the weight they deserve. Heavy cloth hanging over stone, sometimes layered, sometimes backed, sometimes woven thick enough to create a real barrier between draft and body. Not perfect insulation, of course. Nothing in a castle is perfect insulation, but enough to matter. Enough to take the savage edge off the cold that seeps through masonry. Your fingers brush one hanging and the texture answers slowly. Dense vol, worked thread. Slightly rough at the back, softer where the woven image rises. The knights, sei, veen, falcons, and flowers stitched there are not simply decoration. They are warmth made visible. In richer quartz, these pieces could be rolled, packed, and moved with the household from castle to castle. Portable walls of memory and insulation traveling ahead of their owners, like a softer version of nobility itself. I like that image very much. A princess bringing her warmth with her. Not in some abstract, emotional sense, but in literal rolled fabric, tied with cord and carried by servants. A kingdom of cloth arriving before she does. Some historians argue these hangings were more symbolic than practical. Others insist they made measurable differences in the room. Both can be true. Beauty often earned its keep in the medieval world. A tapestry praised for artistry could also spare you a little misery at 2 in the morning. That is usefulness of the highest kind. The same is true of the rugs layered across the floor, and the wooden screens near doors and windows, and even the arrangement of chests and chairs. Everything helps slow the movement of air. A room in winter becomes a puzzle of currents. Draft from the window, smoke from the hearth, warmth falling and rising, cold sinking and creeping. The princess's chamber is not arranged by whim. It has been taught by many winters, where each thing must stand to make survival look graceful. And then, of course, grace is not quite enough. Bodies help too. The source moves so gently into this truth that by the time it arrives, it feels inevitable. A princess rarely slept entirely alone on the coldest nights. There might be a lady in waiting nearby, in a tondo, a trusted companion, perhaps even another woman inside the same curtained space, or close enough that shared breath and body heat mattered. This was not scandal in the medieval sense. It was good sense. Privacy, as we imagine it now, was a luxury far less important than warmth. You can hear it once the chamber goes quieter. One breath, then another. The rustle of one sleeper turning, then the answering shift of someone beside or near her. Within the bed curtains, the air grows warmer, not because fabric is magical, but because living bodies are small furnaces. That is as true in a royal tower as it is in a shepherd's hut. The source also gives us lapdogs and comfort hounds, and I would defend their place in history to the death. What is a tiny dog if not a heartbeat wrapped in fur? You can imagine one now, curled at the foot of the bed under a fold of blanket, perhaps in ribbons if the household is feeling theatrical. Perhaps not. Perhaps only a warm little creature doing the work history accidentally assigned it. The cat remains near the brazier, more dignified about the whole arrangement, as cats generally are when humans finally discover a sensible idea. There are even stranger companions in some records. Ferrets, monkeys in certain households, little imported oddities not especially designed for comfort, but present all the same, adding movement, breath, and occasional chaos to the winter chamber. The source is delightfully humane here. Royal sleep was not a still painting. It was full of living inconvenience. Snoring attendants, shifting animals, crackling wood, murmured prayers. A castle at night was never truly empty enough for solitude to become elegant. And perhaps that is the hidden tenderness of all this. Warmth is shared. Survival is shared. No one gets through a medieval winter with dignity entirely intact, and certainly not alone. The princess lies beneath the coverlets, and somewhere on the far side of the bed, a faint snore rises, ridiculous and affectionate at once. The dog changes position. The cat opens one eye toward some distant mouse thought and closes it again. Near the hearth, a servant adjusts a log and then fades back into shadow. The room, for all its stone severity, has become momentarily intimate. You know that feeling when a difficult place becomes bearable, not because it grows easier, but because everyone inside it starts helping one another without having to say so. That is this chamber now. The source is right to point out that sleep in such a world was social in ways modern life has mostly forgotten. Families shared rooms. Servants slept near those they served. Attendants remained within call. Guests were judged not by how much private space they required, but by how little fuss they made when none existed. Warmth itself belonged to the group. The very air under the bed curtains was a shared accomplishment. By now the fire has sunk lower. The maid has checked the bedclothes folded at the foot of the bed. Another small log waits nearby if needed. The princess has stopped shifting and begun sleeping in earnest, her breathing slower, deeper, more regular. Yet outside the chamber, snow still falls against the walls, and the castle still gives back little of the heat it has swallowed. Nothing is finally secure, only held together. And that is why the next layer matters so much. If cloth, fire, and company create the body of comfort, then scent, candles, servans, and nighttime ritual create its spirit. Because the coldest nights were not only a battle against temperature, they were also a battle against darkness, stale air, vermin, fear, and the long, strange imagination that wakes when the castle grows quiet enough to hear itself think. By the deepest hour of night, when even the most determined fire has settled into embers, and the castle begins that long, inward sigh it makes before dawn, the struggle for warmth becomes more intimate. Up to now we have had walls, cloth, hearth, servants, dogs, rugs, curtains, all the visible machinery of comfort. But what remains when the room is dark? The sounds are smaller, and the princess can no longer keep winter at bay simply by being awake. At that hour, the smallest things matter most. A sachet beneath the pillow, a candle left burning a little longer, a maid sleeping lightly in the next alcove, a folded extra blanket within easy reach, the smell of herbs in the bedding, the memory of heat in the sheets, the body itself curled inward, conserving what it can. The source understands this beautifully. It knows that the coldest part of the night is not only physical, it is psychological. The room grows darker. The fire grows quieter. Imagination grows bolder. That is why scent becomes so important. Modern people often think of perfume as a luxury first, perhaps even a frivolity. In a medieval chamber, it was something more practical and much more necessary. The air inside a castle room could turn stale quickly. Smoke, wool, food, tallow, damp stone, sweated fabric, old wood, animals. Human breath held too long behind curtains and hangings. Add pests to that. Fleas, lice, bed, insects. The tiny, determined republic of life that always finds a place where people and heat gather. And suddenly, herbs stop seeming decorative and start seeming wise. The source is rich with these details, and rightly so. Lavender stitched into linen sachets. Rosemary and thyme tucked between layers. Mint, chamomile, wormwood, rue, sage, each with some combination of practical use, inherited belief, and hopeful exaggeration attached to it. When body heat reached these little packets, fragrance rose into the air around the sleeper. Sweetness, sharpness, clean green edges cutting through heavier smells. A kind of invisible curtain drawn around the bed. You can almost breathe it now. Lavender first, mild and powdery. Then a sharper note beneath it. Perhaps rosemary. Perhaps dried mint crushed a little by the weight of the pillow. It is the scent of someone trying to civilize discomfort. Not erase it. That would be too much to ask. Just soften it enough that the mind can unclench. Some historians doubt how effective these herbs were against insects in any long-term sense. They are probably right to doubt. Fleas have never been especially respectful of human optimism. Yet even when remedies failed absolutely, they often succeeded relatively. A room that smells better is easier to sleep in. A bed that seems purified is easier to trust. And trust, on a freezing night, counts for something. The source also notes perfumed oils worked into bedding and bedposts. Imagine a maid rubbing a little rose oil or an herbal preparation onto the carved edge of the frame, not simply because it is pleasant, though it is, but because in a world without germ theory, scent often stood in for health. If a place smelled clean, refined, floral, or medicinal, it felt safer. That intuition was not entirely foolish. Some herbs really did do something. Others mostly comforted. Both roles mattered. I have always found it touching that medieval comfort depended so much on convincing the senses that the room was kinder than it truly was. The fire said warmth. The scent said safety. The curtains said enclosure. The bed said rest. Even when the walls still held frost somewhere beyond reach, the small signs of care gave the body permission to let go. Then there are the candles. The source handles candlelight with a tenderness I admire, because in a castle chamber, the last candle is never just a candle. It is company. It is orientation. It is proof that darkness has not yet won the room entirely. The little pool of light beside the bed, reflected in a brass holder or softened by a tallow glow, becomes a kind of emotional architecture, as necessary in its way as the canopy overhead. You can see it now. One candle, still alive, beside the bed. The flame trembling whenever the air shifts. Its light crawling across the bedposts, glancing off rings set down on a table, catching the edge of a basin, then withdrawing into shadow. It makes the chamber smaller. friendlier, more legible. That matters when the rest of the castle has sunk into blackness and only the old noises remain. Some households called the last flame something like a soul light, or treated it with similar reverence. The exact names and customs varied, but the principle is clear in the source. Light was protective, spiritually, emotionally, practically. Darkness belonged too easily to fear, to thieves of thought, to the strange forms a tapestry can become when your mind is tired enough. A candle kept watch when the princess could not. Experts still debate whether medieval people feared the dark more than we do, or simply knew it more intimately. I suspect both are true. Their nights were full of ritual, routine, and company. Yes, but also of real uncertainty. The candle did not only let one see, it kept the imagination from taking the entire room for itself. And what happens when the candle gutters? That may be the most delicate moment in the entire chamber. The wax has run low. The flame leans once, then again. It brightens suddenly, almost bravely, then shrinks. For a breath or two, the whole room seems to wait. The princess half wakes, perhaps, or turns in her sleep toward the light. A maid in the next alcove listens without moving. Then the flame sighs out. There is one heartbeat of complete dark. The source understands the power of that instant. It is not loud. It is not dramatic in the modern sense. Yet it changes everything. Without the candle, the chamber becomes a space known by memory rather than sight. The bed remains. The curtains remain. The embers remain. But the eye loses its gentle anchor. Still, the princess does not call out. She has practiced this. She knows the room well enough to trust its darkness a little. That itself is a kind of courage. The fire, low as it is, sends one brief flicker and the outlines return. Bed, wall, table, curtain, ordinary again. Enough to calm the mind. Sleep returns, but not everyone sleeps so deeply. The source gives us one of the loveliest figures in the whole castle, the chambermaid or firekeeper in the adjoining alcove, wrapped in a thin cloak, sleeping lightly, never fully surrendered to the night because someone else depends on her wakefulness. Her duties are not grand. Keep the embers alive. Check the curtains. Listen for sparks. Bring more wood if needed. Tend the warm life of the room without disturbing the one who outranks her. That is almost unbearably intimate, in the old domestic way. Not romance. Kari. The sort of care history often forgets because it leaves little monument behind. A girl with cracked hands from wash water in cold corridors, waking at intervals to keep another woman from freezing before dawn. Royal luxury has many invisible names beneath it. You can picture her now. The fire is low. She rises from the stool or narrow cot in the alcove. Her breath clouds the air at once. Bare feet or thin shoes on rushes. She kneels at the hearth and stirs the ash until a hidden red begins to glow brighter. Then a small log. A little breath. A faint ribbon of smoke. The room warms by degrees so slight that only someone who lived here would notice them. Yet those degrees are everything. A lesser-known detail in the source mentions little bells or flint kept ready, and young attendants assigned to candle and hearth duty. It makes sense. To live by flame meant to tend it constantly. A room did not remain warm by status. It remained warm by service. The princess sleeps through most of this. Or perhaps not fully. Medieval sleep may have come in stages, first sleep and second sleep, as some historians note, with waking intervals in between. If so, she may stir in the dark, hear the soft scrape at the hearth, smell a fresh ribbon of oak smoke, murmur a prayer, and fall back under. That rhythm feels right for the world the source builds. Sleep not as oblivion, but as a truce broken and repaired more than once before morning. The source also glances at the emotional life of darkness. Night prayers, protective gestures, beds angled toward holy images, little habits inherited because fear likes ritual and ritual answers in kind. A cross traced in the air, a whispered line in Latin, a blessing over the room. It would be a mistake to treat these as mere superstition. They were also technologies of calm. The human mind rests better when it has completed its gestures against danger. You know that feeling when locking the door, checking the window, and turning off the light does not change the whole world, but changes enough of it that the body agrees to sleep. Medieval people had their version of that. A banked fire, a prayer, a candle, a sachet, a servant nearby, a dog at the feet, curtains drawn, the system complete. And finally, the room begins moving toward dawn. Not with bright light, not yet. First, only a thinning of blackness, the sense that the air has changed color, though your eyes cannot prove it. Then perhaps the maid rises once more, this time not to rescue warmth from extinction, but to rebuild it for morning. A copper kettle appears. Water steams. The fire wakes reluctantly. The bedclothes are shaken, turned, aired. Damp must not linger in feathers. Ash must not pile too high. Curtains part a little. Pale light enters cold and colorless. The princess opens her eyes. Her lips are pale. Her fingers may still be stiff. The room is not cozy in the modern sense, and the source is careful not to lie about that. Yet she has done it. Another night survived. Another winter darkness crossed. The little island of warmth held. And that, perhaps, is the true answer to the whole title. How did princesses sleep in medieval castles on the coldest nights? Not because the castles were warm, not because wealth abolished winter, not because luxury erased discomfort. They slept because every night a whole system of human ingenuity gathered around them. Fire, cloth, herbs, curtains, servant, pets, ritual, kade, shared breath, hidden labor, all of it working together to make one narrow passage through the dark until dawn. There is something deeply comforting in that. I think comfort was not a guarantee. It was an achievement. And as the first pale light touches the frost on the window, the princess draws one more breath of smoke and lavender, pushes the coverlet back, and rises into the gray cold of morning with the quiet triumph of someone who has been tested by the night and answered it, not with grandeur, but with endurance. By the time the night reaches its deepest hour, the chamber has become less a room and more a small breathing arrangement of agreements. Fire agrees not to die completely. Curtains agree to hold their pocket of warmer air. Rugs agree to keep the stone from biting too hard through slippers and bare heels. Herbs agree to sweeten what smoke and wool would otherwise make heavy. The bed agrees to keep the princess above the floor, inside layers, within reach of whatever warmth the human body can still persuade the night to yield. Nothing in the room is powerful enough to conquer winter alone. Everything survives by assisting everything else. That is why the source turns so naturally toward the hidden community inside the chamber. Warmth in a medieval castle was never a private achievement. Even for a princess, perhaps especially for a princess, it was made out of many small presences working together. A servant near the hearth, a lady-in-waiting in the adjoining space, a little dog in the coverlets, a cat beside the brazier, a second body in the room, breathing steadily in the same dark, a stack of folded blankets ready in case the weather shifted from cruel to absurd. Modern people tend to imagine privacy as one of the great rewards of status. Larger room, heavier door, fewer people admitted across the threshold. But winter alters values. On the coldest nights, a chamber too empty can feel less noble than dangerous. Human beings are useful sources of heat. So are animals, and the medieval world was not embarrassed to notice it. Picture the room now, after the last candle has been trimmed and the final sensible instructions have been whispered. The princess is already tucked within the curtained bed. Her maid has checked the edges of the quilts. Another woman, perhaps a trusted attendant or younger, noble companion, has settled into a truckle bed or pallet not far away, near enough to hear if she is called, near enough that her own body heat matters in the overall climate of the chamber. The little dog circles twice at the foot of the bed and disappears under the coverlet with the tiny sigh of a creature who has done this all its life and sees no reason to make a philosophy of it. The cat remains by the brazier, stretched so close to the iron that its whiskers seem to glow at the tips. I have always loved that image because it ruins the polished fantasy just enough to make it true. Royal winter's sleep was not one pale girl alone in a giant bed, while moonlight made her look poetic. It was a collective operation involving fur, fire, women with practical hands, and animals with excellent instincts. The source also gives us wall hangings, wooden screens, and layered fabric in a more emotional sense here. Earlier, they helped us understand the mechanics of insulation. Now they begin to feel like companions. The tapestry near the bed does not only block a little draft from the masonry, it also keeps the room from feeling naked. The curtain does not only hold warm air, it makes a border, a softer inside and a harsher outside. The rug under the stool does not only stop the worst of the chill from the stones, it makes the act of stepping down from the bed in the dark feel less like leaving safety entirely. You know that feeling when a room full of objects gradually stops being a collection of things and starts feeling like a group of silent helpers? That is the mood here. The chamber itself becomes tender. If one can say that about a room in a castle tower, its tenderness is limited, practical, imperfect, but real. The carved chest along the outer wall breaks one corridor of air. The hanging behind the bed catches a little cold before it reaches the sleeper. The screen near the door softens the first shock when someone enters or exits. A stool holds the warmed robe within easy reach. A covered pot keeps ash or coals ready. A small bench near the hearth gives the maid somewhere to wait without sleeping too deeply. Each object has a duty. The fire, of course, remains central, not because it wins, but because it must be continually prevented from losing. The source is careful about this, and it feels important to keep that care. Medieval hearths were blessings with tempers. They gave heat, light, cooked food, dried, damp cloth, calmed frightened minds, and made winter rooms bearable. They also smoked, spat sparks, consumed astonishing amounts of wood, and threatened to ruin everything if neglected. A chamber fire through the deep hours was not simply left to chance. Someone watched it, even if only lightly, even if only half awake, even if only from long habit. Imagine the chambermaid again in the alcove, a rough wool cloak around her shoulders, hands reddened from wash water and cold corridors, hair partly covered, eyes trained to open at certain sounds, a log shifting, the hush of embers going too quiet, the odd crisp whisper that may mean a curtain has fallen a little too near the brazier. She is not a heroine in the formal sense, yet she is the reason the room does not wake frozen. This is the sort of person history depends on and then mostly forgets to thank. The source keeps nudging us toward that truth, and rightly so. Princess Comfort was built from invisible labor. Someone else stayed lightly uncomfortable so that the noble sleeper could remain mostly warm. Someone hauled the wood. Someone dried the rushes. Someone shook out the bedclothes in the gray cold of morning. Someone beat the tapestry clean. Someone turned the mattress. Someone refilled the herb sachets. Someone watched the sparks and closed the shutters tighter and opened them again when daylight came. Honestly, I find that more moving than the luxury itself. Because once you see the labor, the room changes. The curtain is no longer just a curtain. It is stitching, transport, hanging, dusting, mending. The blanket is weaving, shearing, dyeing, storage, brushing. The fire is chopping, carrying, stacking, feeding, sweeping. Nothing in the chamber appears by magic. Winter makes that painfully obvious. Now the sleeping arrangements deepen. On the coldest nights, the source suggests, the princess might not sleep entirely alone, even within her own bed space. A trusted companion, a younger sister, a lady in waiting, or in some cases a child might share the warmth of the bed or sleep close enough beneath the same curtain line that breath and body heat collect. This is not modern privacy and should not be judged by modern nervousness. It is practical intimacy. The medieval world understood that one warm body is useful, two are wiser, and three may begin to resemble strategy. A shared bed also quiets the mind. There is a particular comfort in hearing another person breathe in the dark. The room may still creak. The shutters may still complain softly. Somewhere, a gust may slide around the tower and brush the glass or horn pane with an icy hand. but steady breathing says all is well enough for now. Sleep often trusts company before it trusts architecture. And then there are the animals. The source gives them real weight, and I am glad. Too many retellings of noble life remove the dogs and cats as if dignity required an absence of fur. In reality, a little dog tucked under the quilts is both companion and technology. A cat by the fire is both pest control and a small furry argument in favor of life. A hound stretched across the rushes near the hearth is heat that also barks if something is wrong. Even a bird in a cage or a hen in the lower part of the room changes the emotional atmosphere. The room is not dead. It is inhabited. Life answers winter by gathering closer. The dog at the princess's feet shifts in sleep and presses more firmly into the blankets. She may not even wake, but her body notices the extra warmth and curls around it just slightly. That is how comfort often works in hard times. Not as a grand rescue, as one more degree of mercy. The source also dwells a little on the beauty of thick textiles as psychological shelter. This is more important than it may sound. Tapestries with hunting scenes, sun, flowering vines, biblical kings, or bright heraldic beasts made a room feel less like a stone trap. Color matters in winter. Pattern matters. Gold thread catching firelight matters. If the outer world is reduced to frost, mud, bare branches, and hard sky, then the inner world must compensate with woven gardens and imagined summer. A tapestry can warm the spirit a little even while doing a more modest job for the body. I have always thought human beings deserve more credit for this instinct. We decorate survival not because we are foolish, but because beauty gives endurance somewhere to sit. And so the room becomes layered not just in wool and fur, but in reassurance. Pattern at the walls, scent in the bed, light at the hearth, a little dog breathing at the feet, a servant drowsing upright near the embers. All of it says the same thing in different languages. This night is difficult, but you are not facing it alone. The source then brings the focus back to the slow management of the embers. This may seem repetitive, but repetition is exactly the point. Through the deep medieval night, the fire is not a solved problem. It is checked, adjusted, banked, fed, and watched. The maid rises once more. She lifts the iron tool. Ash glows faintly, and then more brightly when stirred. A small split log is placed, not to blaze too high, but to continue the steady, low warmth that matters more now than spectacle. The act is careful, almost devotional. No wasted movement. She has done it hundreds of times. If you were standing in the doorway, watching, you might think nothing significant was happening. That is the charm and tragedy of domestic history. Most of what protects us looks unimpressive from a distance. Now listen to the chamber again. The castle beyond is muted. The hall far below has gone nearly still. The guards on the wall turn their cloaks tighter and stamp their boots against the cold. Somewhere in the kitchens a final ember glows under ash. Somewhere a horse shifts in straw. But here, in the princess's room, the world has narrowed to breath, fabric, and the low conversation of coals. The princess dreams. Her maid half dreams. The dog twitches once, pursuing something glorious and meaningless in sleep. The cat does not dream at all, or so it would surely claim. Outside, snow lays another fine skin over the battlements. Inside, the bed remains warm enough. That phrase matters. Warm enough. Not perfect. Not luxuriant in the modern sense. Enough. The whole source is built around that truth. Medieval comfort, even royal comfort, was often the art of reaching enough and treating it with gratitude. And because enough has been achieved for now, the night can continue into its last phase. The room has heat, company, cloth, and care. What remains before dawn are the quiet, inward things: scent, prayer, fear, darkness, memory, and the fragile, emotional technologies people built to keep sleep from fleeing when the candle burns low and the castle begins thinking its oldest thoughts. The final hours before dawn are the strangest in any old building. By then, the first confidence of evening is gone. Fires have lowered. Footsteps have thinned. Even the most diligent servants have slowed into quieter habits. The body, if it has managed to fall asleep at all, is sleeping more deeply, or else waking in brief, uncertain intervals, unsure whether the dark outside the bed curtains is still the same dark it trusted an hour ago. A castle, at this point, can feel less like architecture and more like weather held in place by walls. That is why the source turns toward scent, candles, prayer, and small rituals with such care. When the coldest part of the night arrives, physical warmth is only part of the work. The mind must also be persuaded to remain calm. The herbs under the pillow begin again here. Earlier they were part of preparation. Now they become companions. Body heat has warmed the little sachet enough that the fragrance rises more fully around the princess's face. Lavender first, quiet and powdery. Then something greener. Rosemary, perhaps. Or mint. Or thyme. Herbs people trusted to sweeten the air, oral medico, to discourage insects, to clear the lungs, to quiet bad thoughts, to invite better sleep, and sometimes, if one was feeling ambitious, to confuse anything wicked that might be passing through the night in search of easy company. Some scholars roll their eyes at these beliefs, and perhaps occasionally they should. Yet the source treats them kindly, and I think that is wiser. A sachet does not need to banish every flea in Christendom to have done useful work. If it makes the bed feel cleaner, gentler, softer, that matters. If it lifts the smell of smoke and damp wool into something more bearable, that matters. If it gives the sleeper one more reason to relax the muscles around the mouth and eyes, that matters too. You know that feeling when a room smells right, and because it smells right, the body agrees to unclench a little. Medieval people knew that feeling perfectly well. The source also mentions oils and perfumed cloths, and it is easy to picture them now. A bit of rose or rosemary rubbed along the carved bed rail. A strip of linen lightly touched with herb water and tucked near the pillow. A glove or kerchief holding a trace of scent from earlier in the day. All these tiny refinements stand against the coarser realities of the room. Smoke, ash, unwashed stone, old timber, winter damp, sleeping animals, Scent becomes a form of selective truth-telling. Yes, the room is hard, but it is also prepared. It is cared for. Then there is the candle. I think the last candle in the room may be one of the most important objects in the whole story. Not the grand torches in the hall, not the vast blaze in the kitchen. This one small flame by the princess's bed or on the table near the hearth, burning lower and lower while the room drifts further into sleep. Its job is not simply illumination. It is companionship, orientation, witness. It says the room is still held. It says the shadows have not entirely taken over. The source understands this perfectly. Candlelight in a medieval chamber was emotional architecture. It changed what the tapestry looked like, what the bed curtains felt like, how far away the walls seemed, how possible sleep remained. A flame reduces loneliness. A flame gives the eyes something humble and living to trust. The princess may half wake and look toward it without fully opening her mind. A small gold blur. Enough. The flame leans when a draft reaches it, straightens, gutters, rises again. The movement is tiny, yet it changes the whole room. That trembling light touches the fur at the edge of the coverlet, the brass bowl on the stool, the folds of the hanging cloth, then withdraws. It is a little pulse of order, and then eventually it burns out. There is no avoiding that. Wax ends. Tallow ends. Wicks surrender. The source lets that moment carry its full weight, and it should. When the last candle dies, the chamber crosses into a more complete darkness than most modern people ever know. No street light at the window. No distant electric halo. Only embers. Starlight, if the shutters allow any. Moon, perhaps, and memory. The flame narrows, brightens suddenly, as dying things often do, then folds in on itself. For a breath, the room seems to lose its edges. The princess listens. The maid near the hearth listens. Even the dog lifts its head once and sets it down again. Then the embers take over. They are lower than candlelight, redder, more secretive. They do not describe the room fully. They suggest it. A dull glow under ash. A line of iron catching red. The curve of the cat by the brazier. The faint underside of the bed curtain. It is enough for those who know the chamber well. Barely. And that is where prayer arrives. Not always spoken aloud. Sometimes only mouthed. Sometimes only remembered. The source is lovely on this. Medieval sleep was surrounded by tiny devotions, blessings over the bed, signs of the cross, murmured lines to saints, appeals for safe passage through the hours of darkness, requests that the fire hold and the dreams be clean and the room remain under mercy until morning. A prayer did not warm the chamber in any measurable way, but it warmed the mind against fear, and fear can make even a tolerable room unlivable. I have always thought that was one of the most intelligent things our ancestors did. They did not wait to be fearless before resting. They made rituals strong enough to carry fear without letting it govern the night. So the princess, half asleep, may touch the blanket, whisper one line she learned as a child, and drift again. The maid in the alcove may do the same. The room receives those little words the way it receives herb scent and ember heat, quietly, without argument. There is also the matter of vermin, which the source never lets us forget entirely. Bless it for that honesty. Even noble beds could harbor unwelcome life. Fleas, lice, bed insects, small, bold citizens of the old world that recognized no social hierarchy worth respecting. Herbs helped a little. Clean linen helped when available. Cold sometimes helped more than warmth did, though at terrible cost to the people involved. The princess, like everyone else, lived with the possibility that some irritation at the wrist or ankle might wake her before dawn. This too belongs in the story, if the story is to remain true. Luxury never floated entirely free of nuisance. And still, despite the pests, the drafts, the smoke, the damp, the strange night sounds, sleep usually wins for a while. That may be the deepest comfort of all. The body keeps its ancient promise. Given enough labor, enough layering, enough dim safety, it gives in. It sleeps, even in a castle, even in winter, even when the room is only just warm enough. The maid wakes once more before dawn. This is perhaps the loneliest hour. The fire has sunk to its weakest point. The world beyond the windows is not black anymore, but not yet light. The color of the room changes first in feeling, then in sight. The maid kneels by the hearth, and the old work begins again. Stir the ashes. Find the red core. Add kindling, then a small log. Breathe once, carefully. Watch the ember answer. It is a humble resurrection performed every morning in every serious household. The source is very wise to end with servants and mourning. It reminds us that the princess did not simply sleep warmly because she was royal. She slept because an entire chain of people and objects carried her from evening into dawn. The maid lights the chamber back into usefulness. Water is brought and heated. Curtains are opened, a finger width, then more. Frost on the window shows itself fully, intricate as lace, cold as judgment. The dog stretches. The cat, having contributed in a manner it considers more than sufficient, blinks at the new fire with almost no gratitude at all. The princess wakes slowly. First, the awareness of warmth within the bed, then the awareness of cold beyond it. This was likely the hardest moment of all, leaving the little climate built around the body and returning to the chamber itself. She opens her eyes. Her breath is visible. The room smells of ash, lavender, vole, and morning water beginning to steam. Light, gray and spare, edges the window. Another night has been crossed. There is no triumphal music, no fairy tale certainty. Only the small, deep relief of survival made ordinary by repetition. That is the real ending the source gives us, and I think it is exactly right. How did princesses sleep warm in medieval castles on the coldest nights? They did not do it by magic, nor by effortless luxury, nor by some imagined medieval coziness that never really existed. They did it by system, by fire and fabric, by bed curtains and fur, by herbs and warming pans, by servants who woke in the dark, by animals that lent heat, by sleeping close, breathing steadily, praying briefly, trusting enough, and accepting that comfort in winter was never given once and for all. It had to be remade every evening and defended until dawn. The princess pushes back the coverlet. Cold greets her instantly. She places her feet on the stool rather than the floor if she is lucky, or onto a rug thick enough to blunt the shock. A maid brings the warmed robe. Another opens the curtain. The room returns to business. Yet for one small moment, before speech fully begins, there is a pause in which the chamber, the fire, the bed, the herbs, the servants, and the long frozen castle all seem to admit the same quiet fact. The night was difficult. The room never truly became kind. But the little island of warmth held. Good night,